Hello and most welcome to 1207 of the Heidegger series. And we will today continue with the fantastic book of Bergen and his clear pointing to what is the development, the astonishing, nothing short of astonishing development in neurology. And we were at chapter 7, what do hockey players know? And I think this is the first time that I've been looking for a whole book. It is quite cumbersome and strenuous to do that. It is just beyond belief. I didn't have I had no idea of the extent of these developments. And I can assure you, there is no common knowledge of this, so you are the first one to hear it. I looked at YouTube if there were any videos from Bergen, but most of them are from a much less interesting subject. Still, it's interesting enough, quite interesting enough, but the staggering effect, this is just beyond belief, it's above here. It's the scientific proof of Heidegger, Wittgenstein, Derrida and so forth. The other book is just spectacular in its field and it makes a very good read as well. But sadly, this book is not on YouTube to speak of. I'm probably the first one. But let's cut to the chase and I continue. Different strokes. People differ not merely in the particular experience they've had, but also in what they are capable of. Differential psychologists, people who study differences across people, break it down like this. People differ first in what they are able to do cognitively, their cognitive abilities. Some people are very adept at doing mental rotation in their head. I think I read that. Sorry. The explanation for why adaptation like this occurs is complicated, but the basic idea is that we have neurons that detect motion in various directions, housed in the dorsal visual stream, the where pathway. When we not experience motion in any direction, these neurons are competing with each other, but none is more active than any others. However, when we perceive motion in particular direction, the appropriate neurons fire. But if they're continuously stimulated for an extended period of time, they start to fire less. This is the adaptation part. The motion aftereffect comes into play when we quickly stop looking at something moving and turn to something stationary. Our neurons that detect motion in that same particular direction are now not firing because they've adapted to motion, so the neurons that detect motion in the opposite direction can take over. They're going to be somewhat more active than these adapted neurons, so we have the experience of motion going on in the opposite direction. they're going to be somewhat more active than these adapted neurons. So we will then have the experience of motion going on in the opposite direction. Do you see here? Directionality itself can only be done if the brain is into it, if it's willing to move in that direction. And then the outside world also have to give his or her thumbs up. So you always have the dual mechanism here. Whereas in dualism, or Cartesian dualism, it is a sort of monism, where one thing doesn't get explained and thereby nothing gets explained. Now, it's known that we can experience a motion after effect not only when we watch motion for a while, but also when we imagine motion for a while. This shouldn't be too surprising. We already know that intentional visual imagery uses the vision system. But the key finding of interest with respect to individual differences is that people differ substantially in the extent to which mental imagery produces a motion after effect. Some people display effectively no motion after effect, while for others it is quite pronounced. If the magnitude of the effect is an indication of the extent, strength or specificity of people's visual spatial imagery, then it serves as a suitable measure of the extent to which they are strong visualizer of motion. A component of what goes into making someone a spatial visualizer. Do strong versus weaker spatial visualizers understand language about motion differently? Researchers at Stanford figured out a way to test this. They had people listen to stories about things moving up or down. For instance, one of their upward stories was as follows. You are running a psychology experiment in which you have trained hundreds of squirrels to race each other up a wall for a piece of food. Now you want to see what happens when they are all released at the foot of the wall at once. You watch through a small window in the next room as the cages are opened and the squirrels leap onto the wall in frenzy. The little fur balls scurry up the wall in a relentless stream despite obvious defeat in the race. Zip! The brown creatures surge up the wall with amazing agility. You see the same behavior in squirrel after squirrel. One swift jump onto the wall and an instantaneous burst upward. Zoom! The squirrels rush up the wall like a giant current. As if in a trance, the squirrels swiftly stream past your eyes in their race for the top of the wall. Zoom! More and more squirrels jump onto the wall and scurry upward. You watch them curse up the wall in a blur, The squares continued to sprint upward in a flash. They spout onto the wall and surge directly toward the top. Your eyes remain focused on the mob of squirrels teaming up the wall. You can no longer pick up individuals as they dash for the top. The downward stories were similar, but of course described downward motion. To measure the extent of the motion after effect that these passages induced across people, each narrative was interrupted as at intervals so that the participants could perform a secondary task. This was a moving dot task. The basic idea of this methodology is to have people look at the screen showing a lot of dots, 100 of them. The dots are moving in various directions. When the dots are moving randomly, you don't see them as moving coherently in any particular direction. But when enough of them are going in the same direction and the coherence threshold differs across people, you can see them tending to move in that direction. The motion after effect is known to interfere with your ability to perceive coherent dot motion. If you've adapted to upward motion, you're more likely to say that the dots are moving downward, and vice versa. So when people are experiencing a strong motion after effect from reading the passage, they should show a large interference on being able to perceive the moving dots. Using the moving dots paradigm as a measure of motion adaptation, the researchers had people perform two tasks. The first measured the magnitude of the motion after effect during visual imagery. People had to imagine motion up or down and then saw moving dots and had to say which direction they were going. The second task was the same, except that instead of imagining motion, they read the passages about upward or downward motion and then performed the dot task. The idea was to see whether people who show stronger motion after effects from imagery also show stronger motion after effects from language comprehension. On the one hand, it might be that nobody shows motion after effects from language comprehension. For a motion after effect to occur, people would have to be systematically using the particular neurons in the dorsal wear pathway that detect motion in a particular direction to the point where those neurons start slowing down. On the other hand, it could be that everyone shows a motion after effect. Perhaps individual differences in cognitive style doesn't matter much at all to language comprehension. Finally, on the third hand, it could be that people who have a stronger motion after effect with imagery also have a stronger motion after effect during language comprehension. And that final possibility is actually how the data turned out. Not everyone showed emotion after effect from reading about the teeming squirrels and so on, but some did, and there was a positive correlation across the participants between their degrees of motion after effect produced by imagery and by language. The more their imagery used the where pathway, the more language about motion did too. So individual differences in how people use their vision systems for things other than language, like imagery, make a difference for how people also use their vision systems in language. Of course, there are other ways that people with different visualizing styles, engaging different cognitive processes, could plausibly understand the same text in a way that makes a difference for what they actually get out of them. Suppose you take two people, one an object visualizer and the other spatial visualizer, and you have them read a text that describes a physical system, like a mechanical clock or an ecosystem. The spatial visualizer might do a much better job of picking out the spatial relations among objects and how they move relative to one another. The object visualizer, though, might have more success tracking the visual properties of the various objects. So when you later ask them what they understood, they might be able to access very different aspects of the text. We don't actually know whether this is true yet. It's an experiment waiting to happen. Failures to communicate. The empirical evidence we have now only scratches the surface. There could be even more dramatic differences in meaning across individuals than we've seen. The question at hand is what the potential ramifications are if people do in fact understand language differently. Could differences among individuals affect our ability to understand each other? After all, when we use language to communicate, we are using a channel of quite limited bandwidth. Just a few words in a particular order to convey deeply complex and richly detailed experiences. To the extent that the way we go from these experiences to words as speakers, or from words to experiences as listeners, is different from one person to the next. Communication might be more likely to break down. So we might wonder whether having a different cognitive style or a different degree of expertise with a domain led to less efficient, less successful, or less enjoyable conversations between people. Does communicating across differences in experience and cognitive style cause more failures to communicate? It's a fascinating idea, but simply stated, we don't know. Fortunately, it wouldn't be hard to test. Suppose you had people come into the lab 2 at a time, because people vary naturally in cognitive style and in expertise. You'd sometimes end up with people who are well matched along these dimensions, and other times with people who aren't. What if you had these pairs perform some collaborative task? Say one person sees a set of blocks arranged in a particular configuration and has to tell the second person how to assemble a different set of blocks into the very same configuration. The blocks are all visually unique. There are long ones, short ones, ones of different colors, and so forth. But they also have distinct words written on them, so the players can complete the task by referring to the distinct blocks using visual descriptions. Or they can use the words written on them. Some of the pairs will settle on one strategy, while others will settle on the other. But if communication improves when people have similar cognitive styles, we might expect to see a couple of things. First, pairs who share a cognitive style should settle on a solution that exploits their shared preferences. Second, it should take heterogeneous styles pairs longer to settle on a shared strategy than homogeneous styles pairs. And finally, it should be harder for the heterogeneous style pairs, measured in terms how long the task takes and how accurately the configuration is replicated, than for homogeneous style pairs. It might also be less enjoyable for heterogeneous style pairs. This is all hypothetical, of course, but it needn't be. This is a testable idea and one that would reveal the extent to which individual differences in how we make meaning affect our ability to communicate with each other. Finally, because I promised, here's your test. Without flipping back to the ordinary image, is this the string of beads you memorized before? How do you know? Did you verbalize a list of names or visualize the locations of the shades? As you now know, in one respect, it doesn't matter whether you verbalized or visualized. Either way, you used simulation. But in other respects, like in terms of the mechanisms you used or your ability to communicate with others, it might matter a lot. Chapter 8, Lost in Translation. It was a relaxing vacation touring the English countryside, but, as all good things do, it has now come to an end, which means that you have to return your rental car. You park it and step into the rental agency office. After a minute or two, one of the customer service representative comes to the desk and says there seems to be a damage to your car. A large dent on the driver's side. Perturbed, you look out the window at the car, which looks something like what you see in figure 47, which is showing a car. A Toyota Avensis, actually, my car. Just like you thought, no damage. What gives? It's possible that the rental place made a mistake. Maybe they mixed up which car what was which. That could explain it. But suppose you compare notes with the agent and sure enough, the car you returned, the very same car that you're looking at, is the one that the agent says is damaged. So now you're in a face-off. You insist the car isn't damaged, just look at it. And the agent is completely certain that there is a damage on the driver's side. One of you is wrong. It's got to be him, right? Right, except for one little thing. All of a sudden you remember you're in England, and that changes everything. That's because in England and some other places like Japan and Australia, you drive on the left-hand side of the road and the driver sits on the right side of the car. The driver's side in England is actually the right side of the car, which you unfortunately can't see in the image of the previous page. There could well be a dent there, hidden from view. Ahem. Maybe this is what George Bernard Shaw meant when he said that England and the United States are two countries separated by a common tongue. On the surface, it seems that we should be able to communicate with one another just fine. Of course, there are the well-publicized exceptions. A boot is part of a car in England and they wear pants under the trousers. There are even some less publicized differences. Don't, for instance, make the mistake I did and toss the verb toss around in public. But all in well, we and our British counterparts mostly use the same words and we have very similar grammar. And yet when we talk about the driver's sides, something's amiss. At some level, the driver's side is the very same thing here and there. It's the side where the driver sits. But at a deeper level, how we flesh that meaning out is different. We have different visual representations of what the driver's side looks like and different expectations about where to find it. This leads us to act as though we don't understand each other at all, in large part because our assumptions about how communication normally works break down. What's going on here is a larger scale version of the effects of individual experience that we looked at in the last chapter. We interpret language in terms of the experiences we have had. And in different cultures, people have different experiences. This is part of what we mean by culture. Similar experiences among people in a particular group that might differ from the experiences of members of another group. Even though driver and side mean very similar things for British English and American English speakers, we interpret those words, constructing embodied simulations based on our culturally contingent experiences. When those experiences are different enough, it occasionally makes it quite hard, and in some cases impossible, for us to understand one another. It means squat. As we saw in the last chapter, the embodied simulations we construct when understanding language depend on the experiences that we personally had. When those experiences differ systematically across cultures, this can in principle lead to the same words being interpreted differently. The same words can drive different embodied simulations for different populations of people. For example, take the sentence, "All afternoon I was waiting for my brother on the corner." In understanding a sentence like this, you might simulate what waiting on a corner would look like. Or if you identify strongly with the speaker, then maybe you simulate what it would feel like to wait. But either way, you're likely to simulate standing, pacing, or sitting. And if you're sitting, then it's probably on a bench or maybe on the curb. Those are pretty much the options, at least if you are an American. The thing is that the way we stand and sit and wait aren't universal. There are plenty of other ways to hold your body, and there are cultures where standing and sitting aren't the default waiting positions. For instance, in China, when people don't want to stand, they often squat. They squat on the ground, they squat on the sidewalk. They sometimes even squat on benches. Rather than sitting on them. To the typical American, this is surprising and can even look uncomfortable. But it's just what Chinese people do. The point is that people use their bodies differently to wait in different cultures. And as a result, understanding language about waiting could involve very different embodied simulations if you're culturally Chinese or culturally American. The same is true of lots of other types of action. People eat differently around the world, with their hands, with chopsticks, with cutlery, etc. They pray differently. They even, how to put this delicately, execute the bathroom functions in different positions. The result is that the very same words will mean radically different things depending on your culture experiences. Here's another East meets West example. If you're an American and you want to hand someone your business card, you likely pick it up with one hand, probably your dominant one, and extend it to the intended recipient. But cultures have specific prescriptions for how to use your hands to give and receive small objects. In Japan and Korea, for instance, the status of the person you are interacting with determines how many hands you use. For someone of lower status than you, say a child or a subordinate at work, you can use just one hand, just like an American would. But for people of higher status, like your boss or a visiting dignitary, you'd have to use both hands. Using just one hand with a high status person would be a blatant violation of politeness norms. The different conventions that Americans and Koreans have for giving objects to people, just like the different ways people wait across the world, could have consequences for meaning. Americans and Koreans might understand language about giving and receiving objects using different embodied simulations because of their different physical experiences of giving and receiving objects. We actually have some evidence that this is the case. From some research in our lab, we had people listen to sentences that describe giving actions, like giving someone a business card or an apple or a cup of tea. We manipulated whether the recipient was a high status person, like a CEO, or a low status person, like a young nephew. What people in the experiment had to do was to decide whether the sentences made sense or not. The trick, though, was that they had to indicate their judgments about the sentences using one hand or two. We had people sit in front of two keyboards, arranged as you see them in the figure, so that the two round yellow buttons were right in front of them. They had to press these two buttons to hear a sentence, and when they were ready to decide if the sentence made sense or not, they had to press either the pink buttons with just their right hand or the green buttons with both hands. We manipulated whether the green buttons or the pink buttons indicated that the sentences made sense. As a result, people had to press either one button or two buttons to indicate that the sentence made sense. And because the sentences describe giving things to people of high status or low status, we were able to measure whether people, Koreans and Americans, responded faster with one hand or two to sentences about giving things to high or low status recipients. How tricky. The basic idea was that the status of the recipient should matter to Koreans. Perhaps they would press two buttons faster after a sentence with a high status recipient, and one button faster after the sentence about giving things to a low status recipient. But Americans, we hypothesized, shouldn't show any such effect. If people's embodied simulations of actions depend on their cultural experiences, that is. What we found was a mix of the expected and the not entirely expected. For English speakers, as predicated, there was no difference in reaction times when people were listening to sentences about high or low status recipients, regardless of the number of hands they were using to respond. This makes sense because Americans typically use one hand to transfer small objects, regardless of status. By contrast, you can see in figure 51, the Korean speakers were affected. When they were responding that sentences were meaningful with two hands, Koreans were slower when the sentence was about giving someone of a high status something to someone of a high status than low status. And the pattern was reversed, though weaker, for one-hand responses. So what we found was that the status of the recipient does indeed matter to Korean speakers, and it appears to affect their embodied simulations of action. The odd thing is that the effect is backward from what we originally expected. Why would Koreans take longer time to press buttons with two hands after a sentence about action that would require two hands to perform? Our current best guess is that it has something to do with timing. In Korean, the verb comes at the end of the sentence, unlike English. And timing, as we've seen, can make all the difference in the direction of an effect like this. This is just one example of how people understand language differently, depending on the different ways that their culture dictates they use their bodies. The embodied simulations we construct don't follow a universal template. They are deeply permeated by not only our individual experiences, but the ones we gain as a result of being members of a particular culture. The skin of a cat. We just seen that people can interpret similar sequences of words in different ways, based on different culture practices. But how? Deeply into the meanings of words themselves can culture differences reach? Are the words that have fundamentally incommensurate meanings because the culture backdrops that people use to interpret them are themselves too different. At its heart, this is a question about whether there are equivalent words in different languages. When you translate words from one language to another, when can you expect them to have the same effect on speakers of two languages? Here's an example. The domestic cat, Felis catus, has infiltrated human societies from Australia to Alaska, but the way people interact with cats is heterogeneous and culturally contingent. In some places on Earth, people treat cats like quasi-human family members. Cats are fed, housed and groomed by human servants who even go so far as to manually clean up their waste. Cats in these feline Shangri-Las, for instance, Manhattan or Paris, largely live long, plump, healthy, carefree lives. By contrast, there are other places on Earth in which cats are used for food. They are slaughtered and the carcass is processed for human consumption in much the way that rabbits or more familiar to us, chickens and pigs are elsewhere. As a result, people in these places have a much broader experience with cats, roaming free but also in processed but uncooked form as well as on their plates and in their mouths. Now, regardless of what language the people in these cat-loving or cat-consuming places speak, their words for cat will be fundamentally different in what they mean, in that the same or roughly equivalent words will provoke profoundly different, perhaps an even incommensurate embodied simulations. To see why, consider how different the knowledge is that you evoke when you read the word poodle, as contrasted with the word lamb. The first you probably don't eat, the second you might. How do you understand these words? Well, some of the knowledge that you access is probably quite similar. Upon reading the words, you probably access visual and auditory simulations of each. Lamb evokes an image of a mid-sized animal with curly hair that bleats. Poodle evokes a visual simulation that might be quite similar to a lamb, but it's certainly accompanied by a different auditory simulation. Critically though, if you eat a lamb, the word lamb probably also leads you to access knowledge about the taste and the smell of lamb meat. And you also know what lamb feels like. Tacitly, in your mouth, under your knife. Poodle, presumably not so much. Assuming this characterization is accurate, the difference for you between poodle and lamb may be akin to the difference we would observe in how people from cat-loving and cat-consuming cultures understand the word cat or its analogues. Cat consumers most likely construct oral, tactile and gustatory simulations when understanding what cat means. But people from cat-loving cultures are unlikely to ever construct such simulation in the understanding of the word cat. Unless, of course, it's in the context of a description of cat eating. The difference in cultural experience can have a dramatic effect on meaning. In the same way that hockey experts understand language about hockey-relevant actions and objects differently from hockey novices, so it simply stands to reason that cross-cultural differences could well produce systematic differences in meaning. As of yet, unfortunately, we don't have any empirical evidence on this issue. You should imagine an experiment looking for a culture-specific incommensurability in the simulations that people from different cultures construct when processing the very same word. But for the time being, the idea that culture practices can change the individual meaning of a word so radically is still a hypothesis. Language as a cultural factor. When culture norms and practices produce distinct enough experiences, whether it's in how people use their bodies to wait or how they interact with cats, people understand language differently. And cultures can differ in lots and lots of ways. But one critical way that we haven't considered yet is what people have to do in order to interact with the language itself. As we'll see, the way you think about events can be affected by how you interact with your language. There's a remarkable diversity in the world's languages. One of the key ways in which languages systematically differ is how they're written. Of course, most of the world's 6,000 or so languages aren't written at all, so this only applies to written languages, although humans are believed to have started using spoken language at least 50,000 years ago, and possibly much longer. The first evidence of writing comes from only about 5,000 to 15,000 years ago. And although most people on Earth now display basic literacy, even today, there remain a dozen countries where a majority of the population still cannot read or write. However, when languages are written, they have to be written in some direction or another. This is so good, I'd rather wait with that. Page 84. But you see, he shows from a neurological basis, from many research reports, it's extensive what he shows up in the back pages, although it is not a big book. The references to, it's the last, let's see here, 35 pages in this small book. It's big lettered and everything, so there's not much to it. It's extensive. This is clearly showing, finally we have some proof of two-handed and four-handed. It's no longer not in the body, it's embodied. And this is the whole thing with the embodiment term. Could have begun with James Gibson, but it took a lot of time. But now it's happening. It's happening fast. And as I said in the beginning, I am deeply surprised. I had no idea whatsoever it's been pushed this far. And although me as actively looking for evidence of these things, I'm completely gobsmacked. It's beyond wonderful. And I know this is going to make it so much easier to access Wittgenstein. And I'm starting to think how many could have accessed Wittgenstein to the fullest. Because without this evidence, I haven't heard any examples for any interpreter like Copio Bianco or Robert Maggiola where they put in these circumstances. Where Suhanden is as clear as it is in Sein und Zeit. And even clearer it is here. Examples. We need that. We need to embody the understanding. Because words are embodiments. Some are. Some are not. And I don't think it's a too exaggerated guess that many of the interpreters of, for instance, Wittgenstein, Henrik von Wright, although very smart, took it to be something extra. Very smart, he thought it was, very clever, but not really in this embodied world. Read his books. I don't find any evidence that he's actually pointing to everyday life like he's doing. And how could philosophy mean anything if it's not embodied? As he shows, and that's parallels with all of neurology today, all meaning is embodied. If it's not embodied, it's not meaning. It's not anti-meaning, it's a misfiring. And I think it's very hard to escape from the misfiring abyss if you don't actively look into these things. And that's just amazing. I'm really happy about this book. You have normal things, you have hockey players, you have people who are catching buses, you have right-hand traffic, left-hand traffic. All of a sudden you understand it's all in the world. It's Eintwurft. And we also understand, which is a step more almost, for me at least, we have always been there. And therefore we need to etymologically go back to the start, where the words like estein, ousia, pragmatica, physikos left embodiment somehow. The trauma or the amnesia. And created a diversion which ended in the Western culture where the body is not even into it. That some people might have a very good ability to express themselves because they naturally embodied. They don't know what they do, but somehow they got the gift. They're bound to be successful, but others don't, and it doesn't matter how much they study. They can never ever reach it, because you will not surpass your original status. The very same day you enter higher education, that level you will be the way you go out. If you're not embodied, which I think is unlikely, but it does happen, you will stir away from the most weird concepts. I didn't do that. I studied linguistics, semantics, I'm guilty as charged, logics, all of it. But nothing of it was embodied. And it was a long trip to get to this place, and Bergen is just amazing. And of course, you're most welcome to go to look for him in YouTube. You will find the other book. Also amazing in its area. A good read, fascinating about swear words. But this is the fruit of the loom. This is paradise regained. Not lost anymore, regained. All praise, I give it 25 stars of 4. Thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.